for Business and Government special seminar with former Senator, former professor, my friend, Phil Gramm. Phil has visited Harvard today. He was a guest in the economic policy course that Jeff Liebman and I teach. I invited Phil because he is interesting, provocative, and challenging on a whole wide range of economic topics. And I invited Phil because I take very seriously the obligation that we have at Harvard to consider and discuss a very wide range of perspectives. And I am aware from my lived experience that I find myself, if one thinks about a football field with two goal lines, left and right, in Washington, I find myself on the 40-yard line of the left. And at Harvard, I find myself on the 10 or 15-yard line of the right. And therefore, it seems to me that there's a lot of space to the right of me in the world that is not always as well represented in discussions that take place on our campus. Phil has had a remarkable career. He was an economics professor. He was a Democratic member of the House of Representatives. He decided at a certain point that he really didn't have the convictions of a Democrat, but did have the courage of his own convictions, and resigned his seat and ran to be reelected as a Republican. He was reelected to the House of Representatives. Subsequently, he was elected as a senator from Texas in 1986. He served 3 terms in the Senate, including a significant tenure as both chairman and member, and then as chairman of the Senate Banking Committee. He and I worked together on what I think it's fair to say is controversial legislation on various aspects of financial regulation during the late 1990s. Subsequent to leaving office, Phil has been an active participant in a range of policy debates. He and I co-authored an op-ed earlier this year opposing tariffs. And I was very glad when Phil was the only elected official signatory of the amicus brief that a group of us submitted last week defending the idea of Fed independence in the context of the ongoing litigation regarding Governor Cook. Bill is the author of 2 books on economic policy, the most recent of which, The Triumph of Economic Freedom, was recently published and is going to form the basis for some of our discussion today. So, Phil, you identified a number of myths. Choose the most important 2 that have led us astray, and tell us about those myths. And if I could ask, choose one myth that has something to do with issues around inequality and fairness.
All right.
We're very glad to have you here at Harvard. Welcome, Phil Gramm.
Thank you. Well, I'm very glad to be here, and I want to thank each of you for coming. Larry and I have always gotten along. I respect Larry's intellectual honesty, and we've differed on many issues, but we've worked together on many issues. And I think if the government would turn over to us, we would do a better job. But in any case, so the book.
You know something, Phil? I think that one of the forms of bipartisan consensus we could probably command among the 200 million Americans was that that was a bad idea. To turn the whole government over to the two of us.
The book really looks at why people hold different opinions about the role of government in a free society. And basically zeroes in on the fact that while Thomas Jefferson says good men with the same facts are prone to disagree, that almost always when you find people that have profound differences in their view as to the role of government in a free society, that when you probe, you find they have a very different conception of how the world works, what the lessons of history are. And so the book really tries to look at 5 periods in American history. What I call the Genesis myth, which is the Industrial Revolution, Progressive Era regulation, the Great Depression, the so-called hollowing out of American manufacturing after World War II, and the financial crisis, and then 2 contemporary issues, poverty and inequality, and basically present what I perceive to be the undisputed facts, and then what I believe the myth is, which is generally conventional wisdom. And almost always in each of these chapters, we quote the best-selling high school and college history textbooks as part of the myth. And then we set about trying to debunk the myth. So Larry asked me to talk about 2 myths. And so I'll start with the first one, the Industrial Revolution. It's so relevant because we're getting ready to live it again with AI. The Industrial Revolution profoundly changed the world that we live in. For 1,000 years, we had virtually no economic growth. People had lived pretty much as their grandparents had lived. And then all of a sudden, you had this burst of productivity. Marx, in his genius, saw it better than anybody else. He saw that we had created in a period of 100 years more productive forces than had ever existed in history. It's what the famous Harvard economist Schumpeter would have called the creative part of the wave of creative destruction. But he also saw the destructive part, which was that it completely rendered obsolete and wiped away the cottage industries of the Middle Age in Britain, undercutting the landed gentry that dominated the parliament. And as Marx said, nothing was the same. Nothing was secure. And that's basically what happened in the Industrial Revolution. Now, the interpretation that almost everyone has is the interpretation of the wave of creative destruction. And so you ask yourself, let's just take America. In 30 years, from 1870 to 1900, GDP tripled in America. Population doubled. Production of mining products grew 8-fold. Manufacturing product production grew 6-fold. There had never been anything remotely similar to that kind of economic growth in the history of the world. And yet, if you open any Victorian novel or any progressive writing or virtually every history textbook, you get the destructive part of the wave described in detail. The Henry George, not an economist, thank God, but a journalist that wrote about economic matters, it has his picture in the National Portrait Gallery. And it's in the same room with all the leaders of the Industrial Revolution. And he has this famous quote in there. In the Industrial Revolution, the rich got richer, the poor grew helpless, and the middle class was blown away. Now, how can you reconcile that with what actually happened? The same is true in Britain. Arnold Toynbee, one of the great historians of the 19th century, describes the Industrial Revolution as the worst period in British history. And yet, in Britain, in terms of the well-being of people, real wages, lifespan, literacy, death rates for children below 5, all those things changed dramatically and forever. The amazing thing about the Industrial Revolution is it never ended. We're still experiencing it today. So what is the lesson from this? And that is, myth can have more power than history. One of the lines I remember from a poem in high school, The Song of the Shirt, it's about a seamstress sewing in a sweatshop. And it has this famous line, "Oh God, that bread should be so dear and flesh and blood so cheap." That line's more powerful than any British statistics, even though the statistics are describing what's happening. And the line is from a poem. Piketty, the famous French economist, quotes Victorian literature as history by the argument that what they say is so vivid that it couldn't be made up. Now, we're going to relive all these debates again in AI. The wave of creative destruction will come and it will be dramatic. I don't think as dramatic as the Industrial Revolution. Mankind will benefit greatly, but the focus of debate will be on the destructive part of the wave. And the destructive part of the wave is important because it gets resources out of areas where they're being used inefficiently into areas where they're used efficiently. In America, much of the reaction of the Industrial Revolution was the fact that in 1892, there were 4,050 millionaires in America. And progressive writers and legislators and leaders were so obsessed by those 4,050 millionaires. We're still reading about them, seeing them on television as the Gilded Age, that they turned a blind eye to 77 million people who had had their lives transformed more than any people who had ever breathed the breath of life on this planet. Now, let me turn to the second topic, which is inequality.
Actually, why don't just for logical sequence, why don't we talk about the Industrial Revolution for a couple minutes? So if the question is, was the Industrial Revolution good or was the Industrial Revolution bad? Would it be better if the Industrial Revolution had never happened? At least to my mind, you make a completely compelling case that it's a better thing that the Industrial Revolution happened. The question maybe is it a good thing that the Sherman Act happened? Is it a good thing that the Clayton Act happened? Is it a good thing that the labor union was invented? Or is it a good thing that there were a set of responses that cushioned some of the losses protected against some of the excesses? And would it have been an even better thing if some of the things that had happened that happened in the early 20th century had happened 20 or 25 years later, so as to permit this to have taken place more harmoniously? I mean, is your view that it was the best of all worlds the way the Industrial Revolution happened? Is your view that if it hadn't been for the damn progressives, the thing could have happened faster and been even better? Is it your view that maybe a bunch of good cushioning took place and it would have been better if some of those things had happened even earlier? Those, it seems to me, are sort of the questions that the Industrial Revolution presents. So,
well, I think those are the questions.
And where are you on those questions?
Well, first of all, I don't think we're going to get to heaven without dying. We're never going to have a perfect world. Nobody could possibly argue that we would have been better off without the Industrial Revolution. Clearly, at least initially, there were winners and losers, but mankind was a great winner. And the Industrial Revolution required dramatic change, and the change was imposed on the established political order. And one of the concerns I have about AI, not to drift off your subject, is how is the established order going to react this time around when government is so much more active than it was before? I think you can debate progressive era regulation, but I also think it's important to note that Jimmy Carter and Ted Kennedy overturned most of the progressive era regulation when they deregulated transportation and communication and dramatically changed the country. Jimmy Carter, in my opinion, gets relatively little credit for the impact his deregulatory policy had. We dominate the world in the areas that he deregulated. We cut the cost of moving people and things in half. We dominate the communications industry, and it's now the source of our new revolution. So,
I want to come back to your.
Yeah, I'm going to go back. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
No, I think if you read the chapter of the book, I'm a strong believer in antitrust, but I think the burden has got to be on government to show that monopolistic behavior is occurring. What happened in the Industrial Revolution in America is we'd never had a nationwide market before. And so all of a sudden, you had these huge businesses that local merchants, A&P, grocery chain, that local merchants couldn't compete with. And so they called on government to protect them. Now, how much of progressive era regulation was the government protecting non-competitive businesses? How much was a legitimate effort to deal with bigness? There are clearly in the progressive era, and even today, there is a feeling that big is bad. Unfortunately, in the world we live in, big is here to stay, because a lot of these new technologies, to be competitive, have got to be big. So my view is, to the extent that antitrust deals with monopolistic behavior, which is limiting supply to drive up price, I'm for it. To the degree that it simply takes the view that big is bad, I'm against it. And I think we were wise in overturning it. And I'm a little embarrassed that some of it happened right at the beginning of my career. And I was for it, I voted for it, and I spoke for it. But I didn't understand how important it was. I was so focused on the fact that the inflation rate was 13.5% and prime interest rates were 21%. And the spending and the budget and the deficit so dominated my thinking that there was something really important going on, and I hardly noticed it.
So I'm not going to debate with you about the regulation. I mean, I like the Carter deregulation too, whether maybe 50 years before it was a good idea to regulate railroads is a somewhat different question, but I'm not going to debate that with you. Just one more question about the industrial revolution period, and there's a question where I have some doubts. You and I both, you with more enthusiasm and more energy than me, have been incredibly skeptical about industrial policy. Government can't pick winners and losers. Government shouldn't intervene in the economy, all that. The Transcontinental Railroad was kind of a big government business partnership to kind of do something with government, like working with companies and supporting some activity, not other activity. I think on any fair definition, you'd have to say it was industrial policy. Was it a mistake? Was it sort of irrelevant to the success of the economy during this period? Was it an aberration, that the exception that proves the rule, that industrial policy was bad? Put the Transcontinental Railroad in the context of your views about the Industrial Revolution.
Well, to the best of my knowledge, in the Continental Railroad, what the government did was granted land, which was a subsidy. Obviously, it was a dramatic improvement in transportation of the country. It brought the country together. I don't think anybody would argue that it turned out to be a mistake. Now, you could be a smart aleck and say even a blind squirrel finds an acorn every once in a while. But I think it was a dramatic success. I think the land grant universities, again, with land grants, and fortunately in Texas, the government gave the poorest land in the state, which was the Permian Basin, to the University of Texas and Texas A&M. And it's a gift that has continued to give to this day. So no, look, not everything government does is bad, but I think given our system and the way it works and the special favors and the corruption that comes from it, somebody wants the government to intervene economically, the burden of proof ought to be on them. And all the things that President Trump is doing and taking equity shares of these companies, and I'm adamantly opposed to it because it's ultimately going to affect the efficiency of the economy. It's ripe for corruption and special treatment. And again, you've got to look when you start this kind of thing, even if your intentions are good, and even if your first selectees are good, you got to accept the fact that it's going to be used over and over and over again. It's like Alfred Marshall, when he came to America to look at the infant industry argument, he saw some appeal in it, but when he saw it in real life, he saw that the subsidies, the tariffs were protecting industries that didn't need protecting, and the whole system had corrupted politics in America. So I think it's the burden of proof. I'm not one of these people that say one approach is always right and one approach is always wrong. But I do take the position, and I think I do it based on evidence. I try to convince myself, and I'm not always sure at my age that it's true, but I try to convince myself if I saw evidence that what I believe is wrong, that I could change my opinion. But based on the evidence I have, economic freedom works. And I went to Washington skeptical of government. I was in the beast for 25 years. I was one of those wise people in the back room making the decision, supposedly, that the young guys thought there's got to be some logic to this thing. Well, there wasn't any logic to it. At one time, was one of the decision makers. I saw the system as it was. So I left government at least as skeptical as I went. And again, I think in a free society, skepticism of government's a good thing.
So let's move to myth 2 about inequality, because I'm going to want to give people a chance to ask you their questions. And let me warn Professor Scotchpole that at some point I'm going to call on her for a comment related to all of these matters.
Well, in terms of inequality, I basically believe in the principle that equality and freedom are sworn and eternal enemies, and where one lives, the other dies. People have different aptitudes and interests, different levels of energy, and inequality is a natural occurrence of competition. I'm not upset by inequality. There's some people who take offense that there are some people that are very rich. But my view is Elon Musk is an example that I like to use. I have his satellite on my house. I live out in the country. I'm not a recluse, but having lived a very public life, I like it. Nobody's ever knocked on my door. But I have this satellite on my house and I get internet service, and it's 1/10 the price of the system I had before and about 3 times as good. So he's rich, but I'm richer as a result. And I gave an example earlier today, but it's a good example. I was in the Senate when my first grandchild was born. And so for the first 2 years of her life, we put the maximum $22,000 into her 529 education plan. Total of $44,000. I looked before I came here. That plan is now has $486,000 in it. Now, where did that money come from? Well, it came from Microsoft. It came from Google. It came from all these companies that have created these vast fortunes. So did they make me poorer by them being richer? No, I became richer because they're richer. Now, let me make a couple of other points about this and then the final point and stop. There are so many games that are played with inequality. I'll just give you 2, and they both are bait and switch games. When ProPublica had the stolen tax returns, Warren Buffett's tax return, you saw all the expose about how little taxes he pays. But if you actually looked at the data, they apparently used the taxes he paid, but they didn't use his taxable income. They made up an income based on what he would have earned had he sold every asset he earned every year. They also, in doing inequality comparisons, and Piketty does this, they count no government transfers in the income of low-income people, don't take taxes into account with high-income people, and then impute income to high-income people based on asset sales that don't happen. Final point, the Census Bureau does not count 75% of all transfer payments as income to the recipients. So when you see that a poverty family has income of $29,000, that's not counting a refundable tax credit. because they don't take taxes into account. That's not counting food stamps where you get a debit card and you go to the grocery store. It's not counting rent subsidies, not counting Medicaid. If you count all those things, the ratio of the top quintile to the bottom is not 16.7 to 1, but 4 to 1. Now, 4 to 1 may be too big, but it's a different debate. So, do I think it's too much inequality or too little inequality? I don't worry about it. If people earn it, and they didn't, criminals and government take your money. But other people acting legally earn what they get, and I don't have any problem with it.
So let me just pursue three aspects of what you said. First, you said that freedom, what was your phrase? Freedom and inequality are sort of unalterably opposed.
Freedom and equality. Yeah.
Freedom and equality are,
Yeah.
Okay. So I understand why it's complicated, but the day we signed the Emancipation Proclamation in the United States, I would have said we struck a blow for freedom and we struck a blow for equality, or we struck a blow against inequality and we struck a blow for freedom. So surely it can't be your position that freedom and inequality are always things that should go together. That surely can't be your position.
No.
It may be that sometimes accepting inequality is the price of freedom, but it surely can't be your position that freedom and inequality are inextricably linked, or the freedom and equality are enemies.
I don't see a conflict with your example because slaves weren't free. So they weren't.
That's my point.
Weren't involved in the competition. I guess my point, and my point basically is that you've got to accept the fact that people are different with different ability, different drives, and that they're going to achieve different results. And the more people you can get on the playing field, obviously the better off a society is. And needless to say, I'm proud of the progress we've made in granting equality in America.
So I think it's a highly technical, I think it's a highly technical subject, but I think you're largely right that many of the official statistics underestimate the income of the poor and therefore conclude there are a lot more poor, and then make an argument for programs. And then when the programs go to the poor and reduce the number of poor, they don't count it in the statistics and make an argument for more programs. I think I would acknowledge that even though my political friends sometimes make those arguments, I think you have a pretty strong point. I think that, yes, let us imagine that we have a year in which, I'm oversimplifying, but let's imagine we have a year in which Warren Buffett started the year with stocks that were valued at $80 billion. He sold a little bit of stock that was one of his few bad investments. And he sold some stock that at a lower price than he paid for it. So he had a loss of, let's say, $300 million. And let's say he got paid for all the work he did, $300 million. And his stock portfolio went up from being worth $80 billion to being worth $90 billion because he made good investments and the value of those investments went up. Now, you could take two positions about Warren Buffett. You could say he had zero income in that year and he paid zero taxes, so it was really very fair. Or you could say somehow his net worth went from $80 billion to $90 billion. And maybe it's complicated and maybe that's not exactly the same thing as income because he didn't sell it. But all things considered, wouldn't you say that saying that Warren Buffett had no income, or if he had negative income, maybe the government should have sent him a refund? Wouldn't you say that that was kind of madness? Really? To say Warren Buffett had negative income in a year and therefore he should get tax credits for people with negative income, wouldn't you say that was madness?
No, I wouldn't. He had no taxable. He had income, but his losses equaled income. And the problem is, you can single out examples like that, but if you start the policy that government is going to decide not based on a set of rules, but on sort of special circumstances, how you're going to tax.
Well, no, I'm not saying that. I'm on your side of that. I actually agree with you and disagree with Piketty about wealth taxes or taxes on unrealized capital gains. But I do think that if you're thinking about inequality and you're thinking about the relative fortunes of rich people and poor people, when somebody's stock goes up, let's say there's a Silicon Valley entrepreneur. His stock goes from being worth $200 million to being worth $500 million. And because he's feeling pretty good about things, he borrows $100 million to buy a spectacular mansion because he's got security on his $500 million stock, but he doesn't sell anything. Do you really want to be taking the position that we should be thinking of him as having no income?
Well, obviously, I don't think of him as having it or not having it. The point is...
But if you wanted to accurately describe how fair or equal or just or equality was in our society, shouldn't we take some cognizance of the increase in his income and wealth?
Well, the problem with that is it sounds good when you're talking about this example of this guy with $400 and $500 million. But if we really adopted such a law tomorrow, it wouldn't be 10 years before it was $200,000 or $300,000.
Phil, I am not arguing for any tax policy. I'm not arguing for any tax. You're the one who said the statistics are bogus because they don't take account of income, which you think of as only having to do with selling stock. So I agree with you about the practicalities of the tax policy. I'm just saying that your statements about income and the measurement of income and inequality are a bit hard for me to follow.
Look, I recognize that people benefit from equity values going up, and they're happy about it. My wife always reminds me, we're fortunate enough to own a little Oracle, and the other day it was up 36%. And my God, I called up all my children to talk about it, and my wife reminded me there are only two prices that matter: the day you buy and the day you sell. That none of this matters, but I think the law makes sense, and there are always exceptions, and I found in public life, and I'm not trying to pull you into a debate you don't want to be in, but I am always alert to things that sound reasonable when applied to an individual. And it seemed to be well-intended, end up being in public policy very harmful. Our tax law, I wish we had a much simpler system with fewer deductions and credits, or I could support eliminating all of them, and lower rates. A purer, simpler system is what I would like to have. But I don't think people ought to have to pay taxes or feel guilty about some stock going up in value. When they sell it, they've got realized income, they got to pay taxes on it.
And is it okay with you that if they give it to charity, then they never pay any taxes on the gain? Is it okay with you that if they give it to their children, that the gain completely escapes taxation? Is that all okay with you too?
Well, they got to die to escape the taxation.
Yeah, okay, but so
look,
somebody buys Microsoft stock when it's at 1.
Well, look,
they bequeath it to their children when it's at 100, and their children sell it when it's at 110, and the only capital gain that's ever noticed is 10 under the law of the United States. Would you join me in supporting changing that so that at least there's a tax paid on 109 in that case?
Well, if I give my children Microsoft, my basis goes with that gift.
No, it doesn't.
Oh, yes, it does.
Not if you do it in your will.
Well, and if I die,
yeah,
then I get a step up in basis. Look, I would be very happy to see the government eliminate the death tax and keep the capital gains, or eliminate the capital gains and keep the death tax. The problem is we have both. And as you get older, if you have assets, I've got a lot of assets I'd like to sell, but I can't sell them. I got to die with them to avoid the capital gains tax. And they're going to pay death tax on it anyway.
So we could solve that. So if we just passed a law that said that your children or whoever you bequeath them to would have your original basis, then the incentive to hold them would be much weaker.
Well, if you got rid of the death tax with it, it would be a different ballgame. I mean, you're taxing it twice is the problem. And so anybody old is fearful that they're going to sell an asset and then die the next day. And then their heirs will have to pay both taxes. So anyway.
Floor's open for some questions.
Please stand up and speak loudly because people
are going to use the mics because there are people you have to use the mics because there are people watching this on Zoom.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you very much for your time and for your intervention. My name is Carlo Giannone and I'm a student here.
Get the mic closer.
My name is Carlo Giannone and I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. My question is the following. You talked about inequality in terms of skills. Like if you are more skilled, you can reach more in life. And then it makes sense, let's say, to have inequalities. But what about the fact that everyone starts from a different initial point? Let's say, what about the fact that wealth is inherited? For example, Thomas Piketty in Europe did a very famous book, The Capitalism of the 21st Century, mentioning how 50% of rich people in Europe are rich because of inheritance and not because, let's say, of income. How do you reply to the fact that most of the people reach what they reach, not because of the income that they produce, but because of the wealth they inherited and the fact that if you are the daughter of a banker in JP Morgan, it's not the same of being the daughter of a farmer?
Yeah, I'm not sure I understood all that, but is the question, how do I feel about inherited wealth? Well, first of all, most wealthy people in America have not inherited their wealth. Most people have made it. But I think if people work hard and save their money, they ought to have the right to pass the wealth on to their children. We had a big debate in the Reagan tax cut in that I wanted to do something about death taxes. And we took this proposal that let a person give their company to their employees tax-free, but not to their children and grandchildren. And it seemed absurd to me, but it's the law of the land. So I don't have a problem with inherited wealth, but I don't get confused. most people in America made their money. If their parents made it, they worked hard for it, I got no problem with it.
Hi there, my name is Luke. I'm an undergrad. I have a question. This is actually for both of you. So this is actually something that Mr. Summers, you mentioned at the beginning. You guys both worked together in the 90s and you both worked on a lot of deregulation legislation. And I think there's an argument from some people probably further on the left in terms of the yardage line that argue that that led to some issues such as like the Great Financial Crisis. Do either of you have responses to those criticisms or have any regrets about what you worked together to pass during that era?
Why don't you go ahead, because I'm not sure I got the whole question.
The question was, are we jointly contrite for the legislation we worked on in connection with financial deregulation that many on the left think contributed substantially to the financial crisis? So I'll answer for me. I don't know whether Phil will agree. If we had the benefit of perfect foresight and we knew everything that was going to happen, there are things we would have legislated about that we did not legislate about. So it is not perfect and not what you would have done with the benefit of hindsight. Are the actions that were in the bill, the principal bill that's discussed, the repeal of Glass-Steagall, important contributors or at all contributors to the financial crisis? I would argue that the answer to that question is no. And I would make the following points. The essence of it was the requirement that banking and investment banking be separated. So question one, were there any combinations between banks and investment banks that took place after 1998 when the law was passed, 1999, when the law was passed, that would not have been possible before? Answer, no. Second question, what were the main institutions that were involved with the financial crisis? Bear Stearns, untouched, pure investment bank. Lehman Brothers, untouched, pure investment bank. Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, government-sponsored enterprises, not affected. AIG, insurance company, not affected by the banking, investment banking combination. Wachovia, what's that? Wachovia and Washington Mutual, same thing. So I think that's a hard argument. I think it's actually a very hard argument to make. And I think more generally, you could make a strong argument that the things that were done that contained the financial crisis, Bear Stearns being merged into JP Morgan, the investment bank, Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley getting access to the discount window, in fact, would not have been possible with what we did. So I think the case that the Glass-Steagall repeal contributed is intellectually incoherent and actually not a defensible argument. I think there is a more serious set of questioning that can be addressed with respect to a different law that Senator Gramm pushed and that I, as Treasury Secretary, supported, the deregulation in certain respects of commodity derivative trading. And I think that's a very technical subject that I'm not going to try to summarize here. I would just say that whatever authority remained after what we did was completely unused by the administration for 8 years afterwards. So they didn't even use the authority they had. So any argument that if they had more authority, they would have stopped the problem is, I think, a very difficult thing to justify. I think you can debate and I have a particular perspective because I'm committed to what I did, whether or not the derivative problems that were part of the financial crisis were or were not addressed by the legislation that passed in 2000, and that's a debate that people can have. And I think there's one other point which is very technical, but the motivation for the deregulation legislation was not a generalized desire to have more deregulation. The motivation from the point of view of the administration, though I'm not sure this is true from Senator Gramm's point of view, the motivation from the administration was that there had been a set of statements made by the CFTC that, in our judgment, threatened the enforceability of literally trillions of dollars of contracts, and that it was necessary to make a statement to clarify that enforceability. And if that had not been done, if those statements had not been made, there would have been no impetus to legislation. So I'm sorry to say that the regulators at the CFTC, who some see as the heroes of the tale because they were pushing for more regulation, I actually think provided an example of what Senator Gramm talked about earlier when he talked about how well-intentioned acts can be counterproductive once they actually happen in place. But to summarize, there's no case with respect to Glass-Steagall. There's room for a bunch of debate with respect to the CFMA, but I would say the descriptions of the arguments that have appeared in a number of progressive publications are, to put it politely, unnuanced in terms of understanding the actual complexities of the situation.
Let me just respond very briefly. I agree with everything Larry said, but Gramm Leach Bliley did not deregulate anything. It simply allowed, within well-financed holding companies, joint operations, but each individual part, the insurance part, the banking part, security part, were regulated under exactly the same laws that had existed before. The commodity futures authorization bill would have been a non-event had it not been this threat to the sanctity of contracts based on what the chairman of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission had said about oil production related to futures, basically raising the whole question about whether contracts could be enforced. So one of my children once bragged that his father had caused a financial crisis. So it wasn't all that bad. No, I never took, look, I've been criticized a lot. I never took it very seriously. There's just no evidence to substantiate. If you read the chapter in my book, you'll see it doesn't hold water.
Oh.
Alfredo Gomez.
We're going to take 3 questions, and then we're going to answer them as a group.
Alfredo Gomez. My affiliation is with the Graduate School of Education. So my question is about the economic inequalities faced by the disabled community. Over the last couple of years, we see institutions like the Century Foundation, the Urban Institute, and others sort of releasing reports around the challenges, the economic challenges facing the disabled community and the inequalities that they face. How do we think about, in light of what some of those reports suggest, how do we think about the economic empowerment and the potential for economic empowerment that exists within a disabled community? And how do policy decisions help facilitate that empowerment and independence?
So there's only me and him left? There's just three
Uh,
questions left?
I'm
One-
gonna forget these questions.
I'll
You'll
help you.
remember them. Go
Well,
ahead.
I only asked because I feel bad that no women here have gotten to ask questions. So if you want to take my question, you can have mine. It's been all
No,
men.
go ahead. Oh, okay. She's prettier than you, so, and I'm old, I can say
Bill,
that, so.
you're at Harvard in the
No, I
21st
know.
century. I would just advise you towards caution.
But I'm not president. I'm not president of Harvard. I'm not on the payroll here, and I'm old.
Yeah, I understand.
so
I just
Go ahead.
I advise you towards caution,
Yes,
my
ma'am.
friend.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. I'm a sophomore at the college. My question lies a little bit more in the extremes of what we were talking about today. I understand your point that we have to reward American individuals for propelling our economy forward, for creating jobs. But at what point do we draw a line? The Times released an article a couple months ago that Elon Musk is set to be the first trillionaire. Is that something that strikes you as excessive and worth regulating?
He's created $1 trillion of value. It doesn't strike me as being, I wish I had the money, but I'm not offended that he has the money. And I'm also reassured by the fact that I'm sure he can do things that ordinary people can't do, but the difference is now everybody has air conditioning. 80% of all poverty households have air conditioning. Everybody's got indoor plumbing. Almost everybody can fly. They can't fly on their own plane. So he's got a lot of money, and I'm sure it's nice, and I don't resent him having it, but I'm no worse off by it. My guess is he'll end up giving a bunch of it away, but I would make this point. He did more good making it than he'll ever do giving it away.
Why don't we?
I'm glad we called on you.
Why don't you, before we get to more questions, since you answered that one, just say something about the economic opportunity for the disadvantaged question, for the disabled question.
To the what?
For the
Yeah, tell me
about
what the
the question was about economic opportunity for the disabled, and I think there was a concern expressed that it was insufficient.
We passed Americans with Disability Act, and the objective of the law was to try to make American businesses more accessible to people. I don't know the degree to which that helps solve the problem. I think the more opportunity you create, the better off you are. And an example that I used earlier today is the number of people drawing disability insurance is directly related to the business cycle. Because what happens is that when things are really going well, people need people, and they're willing to train them. They're willing to adjust to their disabilities. It's always appealing to have a government program, but a prosperous economy works miracles for everybody. And there are so many jobs that you can do if you've got severe disabilities. Now, some of those jobs are going to be replaced by AI, but others will be created. But is there a specific program? I don't know it.
I'm going to call on you, and then I'm going to call on Professor Scotchpole.
Hi, professors. I'm Zihua from Chinese School of Public Health. So only one hand that you have discussed taxes on taxpayers, right? On the other hand, like U.S. government could shut down again this evening. So essentially, U.S. government cannot continue to run without raising the limit of debt ceiling, and due to wasteful borrowing and spending. So from my opinion, right, I think the taxpayers are quite outstanding. Most of them work really hard and pay tax on time to obey the law. But every administration seems to sign new bills, adding hundreds of billions to the debt by every administration. And so what's the moral right here? And what's the future for the US government? Thank you.
I think the question is growing debt, and isn't growing debt fueled by there always being new spending and new taxes an important and problematic issue, is the way I understood the question.
Growing debt, in my view, is principally a spending issue. There are two sides of that story. If you had told me in 1981, when I was working on the Reagan program, that we could have a debt of 115% of GDP, I would have doubted that we could have done that without some kind of financial convulsion. So I don't know where the magic point is, but at some point, investors are going to begin to question the ability and the willingness of government to service its debt. You don't go broke when you can't pay off your debt. You go broke when you can't pay interest on it. And so that day will come. I hope it's not soon. And I also don't underestimate the ability of America to deal with a crisis. I look at 1981, we had a big crisis, and we dealt with it. And 25 years later, under two different parties, America prospered, and ultimately the budget was balanced. So don't sell America short. When duty whispers, lo, thou must. The youth replies, I can. And so my guess is there will be a crisis, and we will be forced to make hard decisions, and we will make them.
Professor Scotchpole, and then give Phil a chance to respond, and then I have a final question for Phil, and he'll get the last word.
Senator Gramm, welcome. I'm glad you're here. Two factual things and one conceptual.
Okay.
The factual one, I teach a class on inequality, politics. There's a special poverty rate that is calculated and has been used for quite some time that takes into account transfers to the poor.
Not all of them, but some of them.
Virtually all. And using that, inequalities of wealth and income have still skyrocketed to an extraordinary degree since the late 1970s. Now, the second factual thing I want to bring up is that I don't recognize. I don't. That's fine. You get your chance when I'm done.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I don't recognize the late 19th century you're portraying. Henry George was not speaking for most of the historians, commentators, social scientists, and I'm very widely read in historical social science and history. I don't know anybody who believes the Industrial Revolution wasn't a net benefit for humanity.
Oh, I don't think
so. I think arguing with straw men is not helpful. But here's the major conceptual thing I want to throw at both of you. You've talked about government regulation, particularly financial regulation, and you've talked about taxes, but you're not talking about the most extraordinary and at times alarming things government can do in a capitalist economy. If we can all agree, and I agree, that capitalism is at its best unleashes competitive innovation and expands opportunity for most, if they're free, if they're not serfs or slaves, it can do that. In the late 19th century, the major source of government revenue was tariffs. It was redistributed through the most expensive, in many ways, welfare program the United States ever had, which was pensions for Union veterans of the Civil War. And a lot of the wealth that was accumulated, and some of it to people like Rockefeller and Carnegie, who did give some of it away in beneficial ways at the end of their lives, which I don't know if I'll live long enough to see this, but I don't think Elon Musk will be Carnegie or Rockefeller in the end. That's my prediction, and the young people in the room can keep track. A lot of those fortunes were made out of government contracts given through patronage capitalism during and after the Civil War. The best thing the federal government did was the land grant system. I'm a graduate of Michigan State University, and I agree there are government subsidies that can be opportunity expanding. Government contracts, patronage capitalism, corrupt decisions to favor some over others, and we're seeing another period of that to an extraordinary degree. A lot of the fortunes that are being made by the people who are attending those dinners in the White House are being made through favored government contracts. And we can't be sure that's going to maximize efficiency at all, let alone opportunity to innovate in a vibrant capitalist economy.
Well, thank you. Let me respond by saying that I certainly agree that crony capitalism is being practiced in America today, and I very much oppose it. The problem with granting political favors is it corrupts the system and makes it difficult for people to have the courage to speak out. I don't agree with your point about inequality. I think if you look, I don't want to get into technicality, but if you use IRS data, inequality is lower today than it was in 1947, very slightly. The census data using their surveys has two big problems in it, where they change the definitions of the questions they ask, and they explain in detail that the data before is so different than the data they're collecting after that you shouldn't try to use the data together, and yet they continue to calculate the Gini coefficient. If you go back and splice those two trends together, even with the census data, I think you find that inequality is slightly lower today than it was before. Your first point was, that's good enough, that's all I remember.
So maybe this is a point on which we can conclude. You and I have nuances of disagreement on the importance of economic efficiency versus fairness. We have some disagreement on exactly what the right ways to think about inequality are. But I suspect, and I just want to test, that we are in agreement on what is the largest issue of this moment. And that is that highly crony capitalist, highly interventionist, highly extortive with respect to adversaries, highly economic nationalist and isolationist with respect to tariffs and trade, and highly institutional threatening with respect to the central bank, the judiciary, and the prerogatives of Congress. That all of that is without precedent in at least modern American history, and is profoundly threatening to the American project, regardless of whether you conceptualize that project in more traditionally Roosevelt terms or more traditionally Reagan terms, that on either of those value systems, the 5 kinds of intrusion I just described seem to me to be profoundly alarming. Would you disagree with that?
No, but I wouldn't even put the highly in front of it. I'm against the protective tariffs, and period. I'm against the crony capitalism, period. I think there are real dangers here. Part of the problem is that it's like this prosecuting political opponents. It's clear that it's happened before. It's clear that Trump was singled out in some of the areas for selective prosecution. But I go back to my grandmother's view that 2 wrongs don't make a right. And when you start down that road, you're assaulting something that's very unique about America. And that is, we don't tear down our leaders, we build them up. And I think that bringing the criminal justice system into politics is very destructive. There's crony capitalism, and it's rampant in this administration and was in the last administration. I think it's very dangerous to the things that I value as being important. I guess my view, and maybe I'll overemphasize it, but an open competitive system is to the advantage of the country, and freedom is the key to the progress of America in the future. It's been the key in the past, and I believe it's key in the future. And if we can preserve freedom, especially economic freedom, people don't understand it, and therefore they don't value it. But if the government can threaten my livelihood, I'm not free politically. Maybe I can stand up and say Trump's a dope, or Biden's son's a crook, or whatever, but I'm not free if they can take away my livelihood. And my economic freedom is what sets me free.
I'm going to push my luck here. If you had to choose as an elected official between a tax and spend progressive who respected the traditional rules of the game and a conservative who explicitly supported tariffs and who explicitly believed in threatening business adversaries and who explicitly engaged in crony capitalist practices. Neither of those would be attractive choices from your point of view.
Yeah.
But which would you prefer?
Well, it's all a matter of degree. I think the last election, in fact, the last 2 elections have been elections where you were picking between things that you wouldn't have chosen either, given the choice. And then after the fact, maybe you might have a different opinion. But it's all, no, again, the choices we have politically are never perfect. I mean, I view Reagan as being close to being perfect, but I look back at a series of presidents who have done good jobs that I didn't necessarily agree with. Clinton would be very high on the list. He appointed good people financially. He wanted to milk the cow, but he didn't want to do the cow any harm. But it's a question you can't answer because it's all relative degrees. I would prefer not to have to choose between those, but unfortunately the choices do occur.
Senator Gramm, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.